This episode covers two cases of unwarranted medical experiments on disadvantaged people by the state. Both scandals affected many families and individuals and was hidden from public view, all in the name of science. When anyone thinks of Quaker Oats and porridge for breakfast, we instantly recognise the logo and picture of the influential Quaker preacher William Penn, and a product that is trustworthy and honourable, founded in 1877 in Chicago. But in 1949, Quaker Oats got mixed up with the nuclear industry in a wayward secret experiment aided by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in a wayward experiment that exploited young, vulnerable, disadvantaged boys. But Quaker had a problem. After the Second World War, sales of oatmeal were high, since Americans had been educated on its nutritional value. But the company was facing increased competition on a number of fronts. A series of studies had shown that a high level of phytate, a naturally occurring acid, might inhibit absorption of iron in plant-based grains, such as oats. If you wanted to eat porridge, you either tried out Quaker Oats or farina, which is the coarse milled wheat, marketed as cream of wheat, which did not seem to be affected by the iron issue. Quaker was also threatened by suppliers of sugary dry breakfast cereals in the cold milk market, who were backed up by hefty portions of advertising. How did a seemingly innocuous breakfast food get tied up with nuclear-age research? At the time, scientists were eager to conduct experiments concerning human health, and the booming breakfast cereal industry meant there was big money to be made or lost. As a result, brands like Quaker wanted science on their side, and they had been locked in competition with other competitors since the early 1900s. Nutrition was high in the minds of buyers of the era, especially since the Department of Agriculture produced its first dietary guidelines in 1943, including oatmeal as an ideal whole grain. In a bid to refute the research that unfavourably compared Quaker with cream of wheat, Quaker decided to do experiments of its own. They supplied the cereal, MIT received funding from the Atomic Energy Commission for their research, and a school provided the test subjects. But it was not just any school. The Fernald State School in South Boston, originally named the Massachusetts School for the Feeble-Minded, housed mentally disabled children, along with those who had been abandoned by their parents. Conditions at the school were often brutal. Staff deprived boys of meals, forced them to do manual labour, and abused them. A letter was sent to the parents of some of these children, saying that in previous years the school had done some examinations in connection with nutritional experiments by MIT, with the purpose of helping to improve the nutrition of the children and to help them in general efficiency. For checking, they would occasionally take some blood samples, which would then be analysed. The samples were taken after one test meal, which consists of special breakfast containing a certain amount of calcium. We have asked for volunteers to give a blood sample once a month for the first 3 months, and your son has agreed to volunteer because the boys who belong to the science club have many additional perks and privileges. But the real issues weren't simply a matter of future health risk. The boys, who were especially vulnerable, mostly without parents and guardians, looking out for their best interests in the state school, were used for experiments without their consent. No mention at any time was made about the use of radioactivity. 74 boys aged between 10 and 17 were selected, In the 3 experiments that started in 1949 and lasted into the late 1950s, the boys at Fernald ate oats coated with radioactive iron tracers, milk with radioactive calcium tracers, radioactive atoms whose decay is measured to understand chemical reactions happening in the body, and were given injections of radioactive calcium. The first 2 experiments' results were encouraging to Quaker. Oatmeal was no worse than farina when it came to inhibiting absorption of iron and calcium into the bloodstream. The 3rd experiment showed that calcium entering the blood goes straight to the bones, which would prove important in later studies of osteoporosis. The Fernald students' experiment was just one among dozens of radiation experiments approved by the Atomic Energy Commission. Between 1945 and 1962, more than 210,000 civilians and GIs were exposed to radiation, often without knowing it. What seems unthinkable in today's era of ethics review boards and informed consent was standard procedure at the dawning of the atomic age. Things changed when the details of the experiments came out in 1993, when Secretary of Energy Hazel O'Leary declassified a number of Atomic Energy Commission documents, spurred on in part by investigative reporting on other radiation testing by the US government, and the intensified concern of the nuclear weapons industry. Then came a damning report, which was published by the Boston Globe. Soon, other publications picked up the story and were urging victims to come forward. A hearing before the Senate Committee on Labor and Human Resources was called in January 1994 to investigate the Fernald experiments, and among other things asked why hadn't the experiments been conducted on MIT students or children at private schools. The committee was appalled at the fact that the most vulnerable people in our society, which are young people that are in an institution, and that they were the ones to be selected. When the case went to court, 30 former students filed a lawsuit against MIT and Quaker Oats. In 1995, President Clinton apologized to the Fernald students, since the Atomic Energy Commission had indirectly sponsored the study with a contract with the Radioactivity Center at MIT. A settlement for $1.85 million was reached in January 1998. Before this particular case, regulations like the National Research Act of 1994 had been enacted to protect Americans from unethical experiments. The lawsuit pinpointed the purpose of these experiments: Quakers' commercial interests, and that there was no right to risk an injury to one person for the benefit of others. In the early 1930s, another case of devious medical testing was taking place. The Tuskegee experiment, or to give it its full title, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in African Americans, ran from 1932 until 1972. It was the idea of the US Public Services and Center for Disease Control and Prevention to follow on from the Oslo study of untreated syphilis in 1928, which had reported on the untreated syphilis in several hundred white males. This study was retrospective, since investigators pieced together information from the histories of patients who had already been infected but remained untreated for some time. The US Public Health Service decided to build on the Oslo work and perform a study to complement it. It initially began as a 6-month survey of the range of pathology associated with syphilis in the population of Macon County, Alabama. The researchers reasoned that they were not harming the men concerned, assuming that they were unlikely to ever receive treatment. At the time, it was believed that the effects of syphilis depended on the race of those affected, and doctors believed that it had a more pronounced effect on African Americans' cardiovascular systems than on their central nervous systems. So, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in Afro-Americans started, and research was conducted from 1932 by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention on a group of nearly 400 African American men with syphilis. The purpose of the study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated. Though by the end of the study, medical advancements meant it was entirely treatable. The men were not informed of the nature of the experiment, and it is thought that more than 100 died as a result. The study was done in collaboration with Tuskegee University, a historically black college in Alabama, and investigators enrolled impoverished African American sharecroppers. Of these men, 399 had latent syphilis, with a control group of 201 men who were not infected. As an incentive for participation in the study, the men were promised free medical care. While they were provided with both medical and mental care that they otherwise would not have received, they were deceived by the authorities, who never informed them of their syphilis diagnosis and provided disguised placebos, ineffective methods, and diagnostic procedures. But they were deceived and never informed of their diagnosis, despite the risk of infecting others, and the fact that the disease could lead to blindness, deafness, mental illness, heart disease, bone deterioration, the collapse of the central nervous system, and death. Instead, the men were told that they were being treated for this bad blood, a colloquialism that described various conditions such as syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. The men were initially told that the experiment was only going to last 6 months, but it was extended to 40 years. After funding was lost, the study was continued without informing the men that they would never be treated. None of the infected were treated with penicillin, despite the fact that by 1947 the antibiotic was widely available and had become the standard treatment. Until the commercialization of penicillin, the only remedies were salvarsan, mercurial ointments, and bismuth, which were mildly effective but toxic. The sharecroppers were never told of the value of penicillin, and it was felt that more research on the subjects was more important than the health of the participants. Throughout, they remained ignorant of the study clinicians' true purpose, which was to observe the natural course of untreated syphilis. The researchers and doctors could have chosen to treat all of the infected individuals and finish the study, or split off a control group for testing with penicillin. Instead, they continued without treating any participants and kept information about a cure hidden. Scientists prevented the men from accessing syphilis treatment programs available to other residents in the area. It was reasoned that the knowledge gained would benefit humankind, but it was determined afterwards that the doctors did harm to their subjects by depriving them of adequate treatment once it had been discovered. It is characterized as the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history. By 1947, penicillin had become standard therapy. The US government sponsored several public health programs to form rapid treatment centers to eradicate the disease. When campaigns to eradicate venereal disease came to Macon County, study researchers prevented their subjects from participating. Although some of the men in the study received arsenic or penicillin treatments elsewhere, for most of them this did not amount to adequate therapy. In 1966, Peter Buxton, a public health service venereal disease investigator in San Francisco, sent a letter to the National Director of the Division of Venereal Diseases expressing his concerns about the ethics and morality of the extended U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee. The CDC, which by then controlled the study, reaffirmed the need to continue until completion, that is, until all subjects had died and been autopsied. To reinforce its position, the CDC received unequivocal support for the continuation of the study from the American Medical Association. Buxton finally went to the press in early 1972. The story broke first in the Washington Star on July the 25th. It became front-page news in the New York Times the following day. Congressional hearings took place, at which Buxton and health officials testified. As a result of public outcry, the CDC and PHS appointed an advisory panel to review the study. They found that the men agreed to certain terms of the experiment, such as examination and treatment, but they were not informed of the study's actual purpose. It was then determined that the research was medically unjustified and ordered its termination. The revelations of the study's failures led to major changes in U.S. law and regulation concerning the protection of participants in clinical studies. They now required informed consent, communication of diagnosis, and accurate reporting of test results. By the end, 28 patients had died directly from syphilis, 100 died from complications, 40 of the patients' wives were infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. Its revelation led to new federal laws and regulations requiring institutional review boards for the protection of human subjects in studies. It has also been the cause of distrust with medical science and the US government amongst Afro-Americans. Men in the study were administered disguised placebos, ineffective methods and diagnostic procedures, which were misrepresented as treatments. At the end of the study in 1972, only 74 of the test subjects were still alive. In 1974, as part of the settlement of a class action lawsuit filed by the NAACP on behalf of study participants and their descendants, the US government paid $10 million compensation and agreed to provide free medical treatment to surviving test subjects and surviving family members infected as a consequence. Congress created a commission empowered to write regulations to deter such abuse from occurring at any time in the future. The original idea which lay behind the US public health study at Tuskegee in 1932, in which 100% of its participants were poor, rural African American men with very limited access to health information or services, reflects the racial attitudes in the US at that time. The clinicians who led the research assumed that African Americans were particularly susceptible to venereal disease because of their race, and they assumed that the study's participants were not interested in receiving any medical treatment. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the United States to the victims, calling it shameful and racist. A year later, the President held a ceremony at the White House for surviving Tuskegee study participants. He said, "What was done cannot be undone. But we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look you in the eye and finally say on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. To our African American citizens, I am sorry that your federal government orchestrated a study so clearly racist. 5 of the 8 study survivors attended the White House ceremony.